Darkfire Audio presents Call of the Herald, Book 1 in the Dawning of Power trilogy, written by Brian Rathbone, narrated by Chris Snellgrove. Chapter 16. This life is but a brief tenure, one of many perspectives a spirit must experience in the quest for eternity. Sadi Jah, philosopher. The clear skies and cool air would have been perfect for hiking, but they were accompanied by gusting winds. Funneled closer to the sands by the narrowing grassland, Catrin and her companions were relentlessly pelted with stinging sand. They held pieces of clothing over their faces, but their eyes still suffered. "Be watchful for water. We need to replenish our supply as often as we can," Benjen said. They saw troughs left by a previous deluge, but no water. Catrin mentally explored the landscape as they traveled, hoping to find a spring, but the only water she sensed was deep beneath the sand. "Do you see that dark column of rock? Is that a waterfall?" Strom asked. "If it is, it's awfully small," Chase said. Catrin cast her senses toward where Strom indicated, hoping she would detect water. She tried not to be upset when she found nothing, but she realized she had truly expected to be successful. Determined to make a thorough examination, she tried running her senses across the distant soil from another angle. Her spirit soared when she felt the slightest pressure of resistance. Focusing on that place, she sensed a very small amount of water, but water it was. "You are both correct. It is a small waterfall," Catrin said, and despite some sideways glances, they began walking toward the waterfall. As they approached, the land rose at odd angles and was difficult to traverse. Loose rock and scree made matters worse. A small flow of water trickled down the rock face, a shallow pool at its base. The water was cool and clean, and they refilled their empty flasks. They tried to wash themselves in the small basin, but the results were only cursory. The murmuring water gave an air of tranquility. A tall tree provided shade, and moss grew thick over the rocks surrounding the basin. It would have been idyllic to stay there, but they knew they had to move on. Despite efforts to find anything edible, they had not found a morsel since leaving the valley. They were running out, thanks to the dunking most of their food had taken, and needed to find something soon. As they departed, the wind died down, making the rest of the day's hike bearable. The northern coast loomed in the distance like the edge of the world. Trees and vegetation became sparse, and gouts of dust rose from their boots with each step. They continued on, well after sunset, despite their weariness. The nearly full moon in a clear sky provided ample light, and the air became cooler, almost comfortable. Catrin was still wary of seeing more comets. She yearned for the exhilaration of their energy, yet feared the consequences. An abrupt turn in the mountains and the rush of the pounding surf signaled their destination, and the exhausted group made camp in a stupor. In the morning they would turn east, marking another milestone in Catrin's mind. Another step completed, and another step closer to safety. At least that was their goal. They ate a little that night, trying to conserve what they had. The next few days were long and uncomfortable. They found no game and no water, though Benjen did find some edible roots and a couple of rare herbs. "Beware the cactuses," he warned as the plants became so numerous they were nearly unavoidable. "Those with fine hair-like spines can be worse than those that look more intimidating. Stay alert and avoid them if possible." The next day they picked their way along the coastline, and the mountains dwindled to the hills. In a few places, as the terrain allowed, deep blue waters could be seen in the distance. Those waters were surrounded by a barrier reef and were said to be littered with rock outcroppings and extensions of the reef just beneath the surface. Strom stopped abruptly, startling the rest of the group. "I saw a bright flash of light. Over there," he said, pointing into the distance behind them. They watched for a few moments, but saw no more flashes or signs of movement.
"You most likely saw one of two things: a soldier's gear reflecting light, or a mirror being used to send a message,"
Benjen said.
"Do you see that cloud of dust?"
Chase asked, pointing into the desert. It appeared out of place. It did not look like a funnel cloud and seemed too narrow and isolated to be caused by wind. Benjen shaded his eyes and gazed into the distance.
"Take cover, now," he ordered.
"There is no cover,"
Strom observed darkly, but his voice shook with panic. All that dotted the landscape were small bushes and a few straggly trees, and a mass of riders was thundering straight for them, leaving little doubt they had already been seen.
"Boil them,"
Benjen swore.
"Draw your weapons and guard each other's backs. If we must die this day, then let's go down with a fight."
Belt knives and short swords seemed like a pitiful defense, but Catrin committed herself. She considered stringing her bow, but she knew it would do her little good in close quarters. Her hands shook and her heart pounded. She had never been so terrified. The roiling dust cloud grew closer, and she imagined hundreds of soldiers bearing down on them, intent on her destruction.
"Let them come,"
Strom said through gritted teeth.
"I'm tired of running and hiding. Let this be done now."
They stood grimly, determined to face this enemy. Catrin's instinct shouted that they should find some hole to hide in, but she knew they would be found. The shimmering air obscured the riders even as they came into full view, and they slowed gradually as they approached. They used no reins, which was foreign to Catrin. She saw, though, it was so each rider could carry spears, crossbows, and slings. The horsemen were at ease in the desert environment. They expressed no hostile action, but neither did they appear overtly friendly. They just moved forward with the confidence of those who know their land and their horses. Lean and muscular, their mounts' coats were lustrous and their manes thick. Even their fetlocks bore long, thick hair that draped over their hooves.
"The tribes of Argast approach,"
Benjen said.
"Sheathe your weapons and hold your ground. Don't do or say anything unless I tell you. It's said they'll generally only attack if you insist upon crossing the desert."
The riders slowed their horses some 50 paces away. Catrin estimated more than 100 horsemen spread before her, and she studied them, needing to understand this new adversary. There were several distinct variations in their clothing and saddles. The differences were subtle, almost imperceptible. One group had thin, dark sashes across their chests. Another group was distinguished by the braided manes and tails of their horses, and yet another by tattoos branded on their horses' withers. Only the occasional rattle of a harness broke the silence, and the riders made no attempt to communicate, seeming content to wait. Catrin glanced at Benjen, who stood patiently. She could see no sign of emotion on his face, but she could feel the anxiety of his energy, and marveled that he could hide his emotions so well. 7 horsemen broke free of the line and walked their horses forward at a measured and deliberate pace. 6 of them wore the same style she had noticed, but the 7th rider was different. He rode clumsily and bore only a tall, iron-shod staff. His horse was tethered to the horse of the leading rider, and he appeared to be struggling to remove his headgear. They were close when he finally got the headgear off, exposing his frayed hair and wide, blinking eyes. Catrin drew a sharp breath when she saw Nat. He smiled sadly and waved as he approached. When the horsemen stopped, they dismounted gracefully, except for Nat, who nearly fell out of the strange saddle. The Argast gave a signal, and their horses backed away. An equally subtle command sent the horses to their knees.
"What do we do?"
Catrin whispered to Benjen.
"You and I will approach them. The rest of you stay here,"
he said. Catrin felt her face flush, and her anxiety rose to a new level, but she would show no fear. She and Benjen approached the Argast, but remained silent. The still hooded man next to Nat stepped forward and spoke in halting words.
"We leaders of Argas tribes, I Vertuk of Viper tribe, speak for all tribes. This man say you Herald of Istra,"
he said, nodding toward Nat, who looked terrified.
"True?"
Benjen nodded his head slightly. "Yes, it is true," Catrin answered. Nat seemed relieved, but said nothing. The tribesmen considered her answer and spoke harshly among themselves. As Catrin turned her head to check on the others, her eyes swept along the horizon, and she saw a light flashing in what appeared to be a pattern. "The Jean," she whispered to Benjen, and he nodded again. She turned her attention back to the tribal leaders. Their conversation had grown more animated, and hushed tones gave way to angry shouts. Knowing the Jean's arrival could lead to a bloodbath, Benjen stepped forward.
"Gracious tribal leaders, I beg your pardon, but I fear dire happenings." "Who you?"
Vertuk asked.
"Benjen, guardian of the Herald."
"Speak," Vertuk said after a moment.
"Enemy soldiers follow us. They are signaling each other. We will all be attacked if we stay here,"
Benjen said with a slight bow. Vertuk turned to the others, and his words led to more shouting. He turned back to Benjen.
"Soldiers follow this one too,"
he said, nodding to Nat.
"But we take care of them. We no fear soldiers, but we'll take you to safe place."
He placed 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled a long, high-pitched note. Several horsemen broke away from the line and brought 5 riderless horses forward. Vertuk pointed to Chase and the others and waved for them to come forward. The approaching horsemen dismounted and presented headgear to each of them. A major difference between these headgears and the ones worn by the tribesmen were that they bore no eye slits, and they would not be able to see where they were led. Each of her party was paired with a tribal leader, their horses tethered to those of their custodians. The tribesmen waited for the others to put on their headgears, then helped them onto the horses. The headgear was suffocating, and being unable to see left Catrin disoriented and queasy. A sudden cry broke the air, and the horses whipped around, moving off at a fast trot. Holding on to the horse's mane, she tried to synchronize her movements with his, but it was difficult without her sight and what seemed an erratic path, but she let her other senses guide her. Through their physical bond, she made contact with the horse. She felt an overwhelming sense of power and endurance, but mostly loyalty. When she dug deeper, though, she could not help but sense the overwhelming sadness. This horse would carry her to the end of the world if he was asked, but the one to whom his loyalty belonged was gone. A feeling of separation and loss washed over Catrin as her mount projected his mourning. Tears soaked her cheeks and the inside of her headgear. Her nose became congested and breathing became even more difficult. By the time they finally stopped, Catrin was exhausted mentally, physically, and emotionally. A muffled voice told them to remove their headgears, and she wrestled it from her head. Her sweat-soaked hair clung to her scalp, and even the warm breeze felt cool on her face. She gulped air as if she had been suffocating. Leaning against her mount, she felt as if he were leaning equally on her, as if bearing her here had brought some purpose to his life. It shocked her to sense his gratitude, and she was trying to let the noble animal know she felt the same when she noticed Vertuk watching her. He approached, pulled his flask from his belt, and handed it to Catrin. She nodded her thanks and drank. The liquid had a tingling sweetness that was warm going down, even though the liquid was relatively cool. She wondered for a brief moment how he kept it so cool, then handed the flask back to him.
"You feel better now,"
he said roughly. She thanked him and realized her eyes had adjusted to the fading light. She was surprised to find herself in the mountains, but these were not like the mountains of her home. They looked more like enormous piles of clay that soared high into the sky, taller than any she had seen before. They formed an almost complete ring around the small valley, and it was cool in their shade. The tribesmen attended their horses, removing saddles and scraping sweat. They used large leather bags to water the horses. It took Catrin a moment to locate Benjen and the others, and she was relieved to see them unharmed. When she found Nat, he was limping toward her, leaning heavily on his staff. The ride had been rough on him as well. As Catrin strode forward to meet him, no one moved to stop her. She walked past many tribesmen who paid her little mind, seeming to be utterly consumed with tending to their mounts. The leaders, though, were gathered in a tight circle, obviously involved in another heated argument. When she reached Nat, he spoke out of the side of his mouth.
"We have much to discuss, but I can't speak freely,"
he said just above a whisper, and at the same moment the tribal leaders separated. Vertuk glared at Nat, and he moved away quickly.
"Calm and confident, little miss,"
Benjen whispered as the leaders approached. Catrin tried to appear composed, despite her anxiety. Vertuk swaggered up to them.
"You, Catrin Volker, claim to be Herald of Istra, yes?"
"Yes," Catrin replied, wondering why they would ask her again.
"Prove it,"
he said simply.